Hi everyone, I'm Rachel, and my presentation today is called Hot Streaks, Magic Circles, and Loose Parts, Making Paths to a More Playful Pedagogy. Once upon a time, in mild-weathered March, at the beginning of the pandemic, however many years ago, who can say now, but long, long ago, I found myself alone with a lot of shapeless time. I began working from my living room, teaching asynchronously online. I lived on a college campus, a giant state park-like space, crisscrossed with forested trails, now emptied of students and closed to all but essential workers. I had medically fragile loved ones, so at first I went nowhere and saw almost no one. This all conspired to create one of the most sudden shifts in my daily life that I've ever experienced. It was a door slamming on the before times. Without really thinking about what I was doing, I began gathering materials on my neighborhood walks, and I used them to make several paths around my house. To make the paths, I found objects like large stones and bricks from a nearby burned-down house. I carried the big stones back home, sometimes two at a time, but usually one by one, dog leash in one hand, big rock or broken brick in the other. I walked in the woods and gathered bags of tree bark from fallen trees to make what I called #slow mulch, a funny only to me joke about the slow food and slow living hashtags I saw on Instagram, and the endless bags of mulch that were my suburban childhood. Soon, my days weren't shapeless. In the absence of my usual routine, what did I look forward to? What provided an engine? Going back to that tree bark I'd spied yesterday when my mulch bag was too full. Returning to a mostly buried rock with my little shovel so I could dig it up. My walks became less prescribed. In fact, I began to author my own walks. I no longer obediently walked a trail in full. I might walk a few steps onto 5 different trails to do my gathering and call that a walk. My paths wound around my house, and I traversed them constantly, crunching the big pieces of slow mulch with my heel, pushing the stones into mud to cement their placement. Crunch, crunch, push, push. Eventually, I started decorating my paths. An old wooden lion I found in the woods got a throne made of bricks. Small toys got arranged on a log. I placed these artistic touches by the road where all my neighbors walked by. Soon there was interaction. A neighborhood toddler began leaving flowers for my lion, like it was an altar. Other neighbors left toys, a small Wonder Woman with a missing leg, a black and white orca. When it rained and the wind blew my toys around, I would often see that someone had stooped down to rearrange them. I have to say, all this helped. I wasn't sure how to describe it yet, but I could recognize I was learning something that deserved my attention and that I wanted to teach my students. A year into the pandemic, I tried to develop an assignment I thought might help my students make their own paths. The class was a major author course on Toni Morrison. My rationale for this assignment was the moment, the ongoing pandemic, the then ongoing Trump presidency, and ongoing anti-Black violence. My rationale was also based on the wide-ranging traumatic material in Morrison's novels, and my sense that reading and discussing this work could be particularly difficult for my students at this moment. The assignment asked each student to enact a piece of advice Toni Morrison gave in an interview. When asked at age 80 the most important lesson she'd ever learned, Morrison replied that everyone needs a place that is theirs, a place they invent, a place they take no advice from anyone. For Morrison, it was her fictional world she created, but she said it could be gardening or anything else. In this assignment, students will create their place and they'll visit it 5 times a week, checking in with updates for the class weekly for 8 weeks and culminating in a brief presentation. One way to get at what I was doing with my paths is the theory of loose parts, a term coined by Simon Nicholson, or loose parts play, as it is called in early childhood education. Loose parts theory posits that, quote, in any environment, both the degree of inventiveness and creativity and the possibility of discovery are directly proportional to the number and kind of variables in it, end quote. Play of this kind includes, quote, experimentation, exploration, and playful interactions with variables through creativity and imagination, end quote, and, quote, Process is more important than end product. Loose parts play often happens outdoors and is characterized by play with assorted materials, innovating, directing, and discovering their uses on one's own. As Morrison said, without anyone telling you what to do. Walking around my neighborhood, I started to find things, and I took them home, and I played with them, and I made something, and I felt better. Students made beautiful projects, and they shared them in class, which I immediately noticed created a new atmosphere of conviviality in our virtual room. Students interacted with one another in joking, supportive, and collaborative ways, commenting on each other's projects or making suggestions. I noticed a kind of space that opened up that separated this part of class. Students treated one another differently. I can liken this space to one definition of the magic circle, what the authors of the article Playful Learning in Higher Education, Developing a Signature Pedagogy, call, quote, a sacred space where teachers and learners transcend the managerialism and consumerism of higher education and set out to imagine and create manifold ways of being, doing, and knowing in the world through playful attitudes and approaches. Here, learners and teachers immerse themselves in the what might be and how might we of higher education by adopting illusory attitudes and engaging in playful, open-ended experimentation and exploration in the safe space of the magic circle. I had hoped some of my students would engage in loose parts play, and several did. I'll highlight 2 student projects that used this approach. One of my students, whose mother died the previous summer after a long illness, focused her project on kudzu because she had always been fascinated by pictures of kudzu overtaking man-made structures. In her project proposal, she detailed her plan to walk alone in the woods with her, quote, dead mother's rusty gardening clippers held together by duct tape and cut kudzu vines. Alone in the woods, she says she can act however she wants. She can weep or she can be gleeful. At home, she soaked the vines in her bathtub, took photos of herself tangled in them, and then wove the soaked kudzu into baskets for her plants to hang in. The place she created in this project was manifold. The walks alone, the use of her mother's tool, the photo shoot, the basket making, the basket having, the metaphor of the kudzu, and whatever it meant to her. Another student took walks by the river and picked up stones she liked, painted them with cheerful pictures and sayings, and left them around campus for others to find. Importantly, this realization that I was actually trying to teach play in a playful manner has meaningful consequences for excellence in creative writing. A recent article in Nature Communications titled Understanding the Onset of Hot Streaks Across Artistic, Cultural, and Scientific Careers details how hot streaks, which are, quote, bursts of high-impact works clustered together in close succession, occur. In order to have the level of productivity and success that characterize a hot streak, individuals need to engage in both exploration, play and risk, and exploitation, deep study of a subject. Course content, usually the reading and writing of fiction for me, is the exploitation, deep focused study over time. The play and risk of exploration must come from our class activities, from extra assignments like the one in my class, and from the atmosphere that playing in class creates. This idea also connects to Felicia Rose Chavez's argument about how daily writing exercises in class, itself a form of play, I would argue, work to combat perfectionism, temper fear, curb the competitive impulse, and normalize risk, end quote. The practice of writing, is it work or is it play? Adopting something like loose parts play as a strategy in adulthood can remind us how, quote, in early childhood there is no important difference between play and work, art and science, recreation and education, the classifications normally applied by adults to a child's environment. Education is recreation, and vice versa. These connections are not well represented in the literature and could be meaningful additions to pedagogical discussions in creative writing. As the authors of Playful Learning in Higher Education, Developing a Signature Pedagogy point out, play is a Play is ubiquitous and normal in childhood, but play in adulthood is less well understood, even more so when it comes to being playful in higher education." End quote. In a process-based class like a creative writing class, the benefits of risk and failure are already well accepted. But what if the risk and failure were, well, more explicitly and extravagantly joyful? Playing in public as an adult, playing in the increasingly corporate atmosphere of higher education, these are radical political acts. They interrupt our fetishization of capitalist productivity, and they create community. They offer freedom. They are fun. Thank you.